Okay, we'll start. Hello and welcome everyone to this week's RIOT Science Club talk. The RIOT Club is a self-organizing initiative that is entirely the career researcher led. We host weekly seminars to aim to raise awareness and provide training in reproducible, interpretable, open and transparent science. Before I introduce this week's speaker, I would like to point out that after the talk there's a Q&A session and you can use the Q&A bar on the side to ask your questions, or if you see a question that you would like to ask as well, if you can press like, and then at the end I'll start by asking the most voted questions. Today's speaker is Dr. Lotty Brand, who's currently a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Sheffield with Professor Tom Stafford, investigating the use of argument maps and automated dialogue for fostering open-mindedness and depolarization. Dr. Brand was previously a postdoctoral research associate with Professor Alex Nasodi at the University of Exeter's Cornwall campus, as part of the Human Behavior and Cultural Evolution group. Her research spans a variety of topics related to the evolution of human behavior and cognition. But today, Dr. Lotty is going to talk to us about a novel science communication initiative. So I will let Dr. Brand talk more about this. I hope you enjoy this week's talk.
Thank you. Can you see my screen and hear me okay?
So screen is, just 1 second, screen, and then, and you're live.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much everyone for joining, and thanks so much RIOT Science for inviting me. I'm really chuffed to be on this this amazing program you guys have put together, and it's nice to be asked to be talked about AccessLab. This is something I'm quite passionate about. It's not actually a main aspect of my day-to-day research, but it's something I got involved with at my previous postdoc. And it is essentially a science communication workshop, but hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll feel similarly to me that it's not just a science communication workshop. I think it's a lot more special than that for lots of reasons, which I'll go through. But also it's important to point out that this is not by any means my idea or my project. It was mainly conceived by Foam Kerno, and they're a non-profit organisation nearby in Cornwall that I got involved with and ended up helping to run some of these workshops with them. So who is Foam? Foam's actually a networked transdisciplinary lab. There are labs mainly all over Europe, and they are generalists. They work across disparate fields in what they term to be an entangled speculative culture, which I really like. They're non-profit and they work entirely open source. Foam Kerno are the Cornwall branch, who are an environmentally embedded research and development studio, creating curious things that actually work for people who really exist. But AccessLab is truly a collaborative endeavour, so all of these other organisations and people and groups have in some way shaped the development of it. They've contributed, they've given feedback, they've really helped to improve and change it along the way, either by funding or getting involved in the design and running of the project. So what is AccessLab? It is essentially a way of bringing together people with scientific training or a research background with people who do not have this training and research to help them find scientific evidence or answer any questions that they may have in their day-to-day lives or as part of their work. So, for example, here is one of the kind of recruitment posters where they ask, do you need help finding scientific evidence for anything from should I be worried about sea level rise because I live in a coastal region, or finding more out about a medical diagnosis. And this particular event was directed towards politicians, councillors, campaigners, policymakers, but we've had all sorts of different groups take part and different themes throughout. And so the main kind of aims of AccessLab, the first one is to open up access to the primary scientific literature and to decentralise research skills to those outside of science and research, but also by bringing in researchers and pairing them up with someone from outside of research, it's to reveal access problems to researchers from an outsider's perspective. And in doing so, I think we also create other benefits. So it definitely is helps towards cultivating relationships between researchers and the wider community. We've had people who have met through this and have gone on to work on other collaborative projects together, even write publications together, and even enact policy change, which I'll talk about at the end. It also helps to create trust and provide transparency about the scientific research process. So we are very open about the nitty-gritty details of how science is published and funded. And it does, I think, result in very dedicated open access advocates. So I would say that before I did my first AccessLab years ago, I was already an open access advocate, but the information and the context that AccessLab puts open access in, it really opened my eyes to the kind of broader societal and ethical implications, which I'm going to talk about more in detail. But essentially, I'm going to split the workshop into 4 sections. So hopefully, if I speak about each of these 4 sections in turn, then the philosophy and the meaning behind the workshop should kind of fall out along the way, I hope. And the first section is that we actually have a session a few days before the main workshop day where we just talk to the researcher participants and we do exercises and discussions with them on their own. And then the main day of the workshop, it usually spans a day between roughly 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. In the morning, we do joint exercises all together and have discussions about the scientific process. And then there is lunch, which I'm not going to skip over because, as you'll hear, this is a very important part of the workshop. And then after lunch, the kind of climax or the main event really is this afternoon where we pair up researchers and non-researchers to discuss a question of the participants choosing together and to explore this question. But before I go into detail about each of those sections, I would also like to, right at the beginning, talk about the extra bits, which are the bits that I think Foam and AccessLab put at the front and get right, and it makes a huge difference. And I think these are things that, as academics, we often forget, or it's an afterthought when we're organising conferences or workshops in the bubble of academia. So firstly, where the workshops are held. These workshops are never held in an educational setting such as a lecture theatre or a conference room. They often have been in art studios, community centres, creative hubs, and this is to kind of trying to move away from the, I guess, usually quite dry and uninviting environment that workshops and conferences can be in. I think as academics, we're very used to being in these environments, but we can forget that for those outside of academia, those who haven't been perhaps in those spaces for years, can find them very intimidating, not very inviting. So this makes a big difference to the feel of the workshop. Similarly, the food, it's not just your university catered sandwiches. As you can see in the middle here, this is actually one of the dishes that was served in one of the pilot access labs that I first went to. And on the right here, this is one of the participants' lunch plates. So Foam Kerno take great care of hiring a local up-and-coming chef. So this example was Hoon, who specialised in vegetarian Korean food. And it meant that it was not only a talking point for participants, it brought everyone together. People were sharing food. It was quite a buffet style situation. It also means everyone feels valued and welcome. It's a free lunch, and I think this can make a big difference, especially if you ensure that everyone's dietary requirements are catered for. It's not just that there's a spare plate over there for the person who can't eat dairy. We incorporate all of the dietary requirements into all the dishes to make sure everyone feels equally welcome and valued. And also, as you can see on the left here, a great deal of attention is paid to creating a relaxed and friendly atmosphere. So there's often wildflowers placed around the room. There's recycled notebooks for people to use. There are Lego bricks that we incorporate into tasks and activities. And this does seem to translate to people feeling valued. So some feedback from a participant in Penzance said that all the flowers and little touches make all the difference. It meant I realised it wasn't going to be a test and I was more at ease. I also thought it meant they actually wanted me there. So I think this is just something to bear in mind, that we sometimes maybe leave as an afterthought when we're hosting traditional kind of science communication events. Okay, so the first session is where we just get the researchers, usually just for a couple of hours of an evening or the few days before the main event, to get together and kind of help to get them in the mindset of what we want to achieve with AccessLab. So the first exercise we do with the researchers is we ask them to imagine that they've been confronted with a new political policy or an economic policy that they have to vote on, and we ask them to write down all the sources of information they would use to make their decision about this policy. And then we ask them to line these sources of information up along this scale from reputable sincerity to glorious hoax. So basically, which of these sources do you know are pretty trustworthy and which do you just know are pretty useless? And the point of this exercise is to show researchers, because often these are biology based researchers, is that when you're looking into decisions in your everyday life for something that's outside of your area of expertise or outside of the topic that you got your PhD in, it's very rare for you to jump straight to the primary literature. It's very rare for you to, as your first port and call, go and open an economics journal, for example. We all use secondary sources. We all use our friends and family to shape our opinions. And it's trying to kind of bring about a little bit of humility to the researchers, that there's no reason why we should expect people to be using the highest quality scientific information in all of their decisions. And it's also to highlight that we have to make decisions every day that could be informed by the primary literature, but knowing that this literature exists isn't a trivial thing. Knowing what a journal is, what peer review consists of, how many journals there are, what a paper is and who writes it, and all of these things are things that we all take for granted, but there's no reason why someone outside of academia should know all of these things. The second thing we really try to emphasize in this session is to be sensitive and to listen a whole lot more than you would probably usually at an everyday workshop or conference in academia. We really want to emphasize that this shouldn't be a teacher-student relationship when they're working in pairs. It's not about telling people what you know, it's about listening. And I think, again, often we can be quite, we can take for granted certain concepts and beliefs that we have in science or in research, and when we're confronted with someone who doesn't have that same baseline, the tendency can be to go into kind of rebuttal mode and be but this, but that. And we try to say, please just listen. And it's really not about having those, this is what I know, this is why you should think, blah, 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 dialogues. And equally, and maybe more importantly, to be very transparent and open about the flaws and the weaknesses in the scientific process. So, you know, there are good reasons and valid and rational reasons for why some people might not trust science or might not trust the process or scientific sources. And we find that if you're defensive of science and try to hold it up as, you know, the holy grail and perfect system, that often pushes people away further. And actually being very open and honest about where the flaws and the weaknesses in the scientific process is can be a whole lot more beneficial. Okay, so in the main workshop morning session, we have the researchers and the participants together. We normally have about 8 of each. And we do the trust exercise with both participants and researchers again, but this time we use maybe a more biology-based question, such as a medical question. And this is to really highlight that there is this knowledge inequality where the researchers are able to access this primary information and use that for their decision making when it's on a topic such as biology, but the participants often don't know about these resources to begin with, and certainly aren't using them or incorporating them in their repertoire. We then have a kind of introductory session where we discuss the history of scientific publishing, how it works, the funding of it, and how we got to this position today, which I'm actually going to go into a lot more detail about, because for me this was the most valuable aspect, I think, as a researcher, where I really learned a lot. And then we often have a session where we discuss how science is funded, how an individual scientist applies for funding, how they decide what to research, who decides what gets researched, and then how, once you've got that money, the work is done, how once you've got the results, how that gets translated into a publication. And we go through the peer review process and what's involved. And then finally, we do a fact-checking exercise with the participants where we pick a media headline and trace the scientific media headline and trace it back to the original primary source of where the headline came from. So to go into more detail about what happens in this introductory section in the morning, obviously it's quite obvious maybe at the moment, especially with the pandemic, as to why science is important and affects many aspects of our lives. So this was obviously written before the pandemic, but even before pre-pandemic, you know, there was a question of, should I vaccinate my kids? What should I eat? There are all sorts of parts of our daily lives that scientific information informs. And the peer-reviewed literature in scientific journals is a primary source of information, but access to this information is unequal. And this counts as a form of knowledge inequality, which is a recognised form of inequality by UNESCO. And so the point of the AccessLab is to help people access this resource. But we know that access to this resource is unequal. We know that people aren't all able to access this literature for various reasons. And one way to really see this, which is a really cool data source in my opinion, is a website called the Open Access Button. And on this website, people can request access to papers, and when they submit this request, they have an opportunity to write why they need the paper. So just 2 examples here, you can see students from less wealthy institutions and less wealthy countries, such as a medical student in Nigeria or a land economics student in Uganda, are struggling to access this information for their studies. But we know it's not just in developing countries. In this country, plenty of institutions can't afford subscriptions to these journals, and even people who work in the NHS, medical professionals and policymakers are unable to access this information. And, you know, we had a previous incredible talk from Alexandra in this RIOT Science programme, who, as an everyday hero, just automated this process of requesting access to journal articles for people she knew from personal experience that students in developing countries were trying to work around these paywalls because they couldn't afford to do the research they needed for their studies. And people like Alex and Aaron Schwartz, who have tried to come up with solutions to this problem, have been faced with million-dollar fines and prison sentences by the publishing companies. And this is quite baffling to a lot of people outside of academia and academics alike. What is going on here? This seems mad. And so we go through a little bit of the history of how we got here, which I found extremely valuable to kind of put it into a wider context, because, you know, no one would design the system to be this way, but how did it get there? So obviously, for centuries, publishing was just how scholars shared their research, and until relatively recently, it was paid for by sponsors, and peer review was done by a research community or a university press. But during the Cold War, research expanded internationally, it became competitive, university sector grew, the funding grew, and publishing became profitable. And since the 1980s, there's been increased demands for accountability, which has led to this culture of metrics. And so academia has kind of grown into this prestige economy where we have this symbolic capital of publications. And this is, I guess, the kind of crux for me, is that academic publishing has these now three quite different roles that it's kind of simultaneously trying to fulfill. The first one is that it should be disseminating validated knowledge, and I think I would argue that this is the one and only thing it should be doing. But it's now simultaneously acting as symbolic capital for academic career progression, and it's an extremely profitable business enterprise. So maybe if you're on Twitter a lot, you might already know this, but I certainly didn't when I went to my AccessLab. But some of the academic publishers have profit margins that are actually higher than Google and Shell's. And we can see why when we think about the fact that it's tax-funded academics who are doing this research, writing the papers, making the content, making the figures, editing and peer reviewing. They're doing this work essentially voluntarily, and signing over the copyright to the publishers, who then sell it back to them, sell it back to the tax-paid funded universities typeset. And when you put it in these terms, which maybe it seems like a radical position, but this is all kind of factual, this is how it works. People outside of academia and within academia, their jaws are often on the floor, because this just doesn't make sense in the context of other industries. So other publishers have to pay for their content, at least, that they're generating, and they often have to pay the creators of that content when they sell the content on, none of which is happening in academia. So once we've had this big open discussion about that, which is very nice to have that space and time to talk about that with other people in research and outside of research, and get everyone's perspective on that situation. We then spend time discussing how science is funded from kind of an individual scientist perspective. So how do you decide what you're going to research? How do you ask for the money? When do you get the money? How much money is there? How much of it is your salary? How much of it is for resources? How long does this grant money last for? All of these things, I think, help to open up and just be more transparent about what's going on. I think it's not unreasonable for people outside of science to assume, you know, maybe who's paying the bills has an input into the results. Maybe, you know, scientists are having to do work to fulfill certain agendas based on who's funding them. I think it's actually quite unknown outside of academia or science, like how independent you often are as researchers, how it really is mostly curiosity driven in what you're deciding to research, and that the funders don't really have any say when it comes to writing the publication. So we then go on to, once you've been funded, got the money, done the project, got some results, how do those results then end up in the world, end up with the rest of the scientific community? We talk about what a journal is, how many of them there are, what a paper is, how many are published each year. We go through each section of a research paper to say, you know, the abstract is a nice short summary that's quite accessible section. The methods are often going to be too dense or difficult to understand if it's outside of your area. The discussion should be openly readable to anyone, really. And we go through all these different points of the paper. We discuss where it discloses who the funders are. And we discuss what the reference section is about and how to use that effectively and how to check when people have made a statement that it's backed up by a peer-reviewed reference. And then we talk about the peer review process as well. And we go into a lot of detail about the highs and lows of peer review, the weaknesses, the strengths, how it's the new innovations that are coming out to try and improve it. And we just have a nice big discussion about this whole process, and hopefully this generates a bit more trust and transparency about what's going on in science and why you can trust some sources of information perhaps a little bit more than others, or how some sources of information might be a bit more independent and rigorous than others. And then, as I mentioned, we put all this kind of information to work a little bit or into practice. We use this brilliant website called Kill or Cure, where it lists all the things that the Daily Mail has once claimed either causes or cures cancer. So one of those is Facebook. So there was once an article saying Facebook causes cancer. And we go through with everyone together these 7 steps on the left. So how can you find the original paper? How can you find who did this work, who funded this work, how it was done, whether they actually did what they said they did, and then looking a bit at, okay, what other papers have been published before or since, and can you actually access the data yourself? All those kind of checks of validity and robustness. And I think once you get kind of halfway down this list, or even the kind of second question on this particular example, you see very quickly that there's been a breakdown of communication, and this is not how it appears. Okay, so as I mentioned, we then go into lunch, which is a very important and lovely aspect of the workshop. Here is the menu for one of the lunches we had at one of the workshops. I don't know if you've ever seen anything like that at a conference, academic conference. I certainly haven't. And also it's worth mentioning that recently, because of the pandemic, we put all these workshops online. There were 3 online workshops held, and obviously in an online setting, it's very difficult to create the atmosphere and the welcoming nature that I spoke about at the beginning. But one thing that Foam did do is hired another local small business to make a load of sweet and savoury gluten-free vegan snacks that are wrapped in biodegradable packaging, and these got sent ahead of time to all the participants to their house in a little box, along with some tea, pencil, notebooks, various other bits and bobs, to make the participants feel again like they were valued and welcome, and that we wanted them there. And it became again another nice talking point, a source of great feedback, that they felt that we really valued their time by putting in this extra effort and these extra little touches. Okay, so the real reason behind this research, workshop, is for this afternoon session where we pair up researchers and non-researchers to investigate a question of the participants' choosing. So it's important to note that this is completely confidential. The participants, that no one reports back to the group about what they've talked about. No one else in the group needs to know what anyone's question is. It's completely up to them. And the other really important thing is that this has to be a 2-way sharing of skills and not knowledge. So one thing that I should have mentioned earlier is that when we're matching researchers with non-researchers, we actually do a kind of mismatch where, based on what the participant's question is, we try and put them with a researcher who isn't a specialist in that area, which might seem counterintuitive, but we do this on purpose so that researchers don't click into teacher-student mode, and they don't, share their knowledge and say, this is what I know about this. I can already answer your question. It's, oh, I don't know that either. This is how I would look into it myself. And they both together go into this question as novices and on the same page. And the other important thing which we ensure in the researcher prep day is that the researchers turn off all their VPNs, they log out of all the institutional logins they have for journal subscriptions. If they can't do that, then they open an incognito mode private searching window where all of their login details are erased so that they are both on a level playing field, and the researchers bump into these access problems in the same way that non-researchers would. And again, we've had a lot of feedback from researchers saying this is actually the first time that they've come up against these paywall problems in this way, and it was actually quite a shock for them. So the results of this paired session have been relatively kind of consistent across there's now been 9 workshops with 168 participants, I think. One of the things that often happens is that the participants' question can be quite vague, and the researcher can get quite frustrated that they haven't got a tangible enough question to actually research with them. So maybe something like, what are the benefits of seaweed? And the researcher will be like, do you mean benefits for the sea or ecology or human health or using as a fertilizer in your garden? And the participant will say, well, all of these things. And I think in this process of the researcher being like, I need a more specific question, and we need to work out what it is that you want to know here, is quite revealing for both parties. I think participants realise that actually there's so much more detailed information out there, that there's not going to be a paper that gives you the benefits of seaweed. There's going to be maybe hundreds of papers about the health benefits of one aspect of seaweed or something. And this is quite revealing, and I think an important part of it. The other thing is that often the participants are expecting a concrete answer. They might have a question about the benefits of something, or whether I should use this or this other thing, or whether I should do this or this other thing. And the researchers often can't give a concrete answer. They can't point to one paper that gives them an answer. The answer will often be, it depends, or if you look at this resource, then maybe this, but you have to bear in mind this thing from this other resource. And I think this is also a really crucial and important aspect of the workshop. Revealing that this is the nature of science. So in our latest online workshops, we had quite a big discussion about science being this conversation, and that each paper just represents one turn in the conversation. And if you just read one paper, it's like jumping into a conversation halfway, and that you can't really take much from just one publication, which I think is something that as science communicators we're often trying to push, but it's quite difficult to really show why that's the case. Okay, but there's been some really successful pairings, as I said. One of our favourite things that happened since an AccessLab is that there was some policy change enacted. So Tessa and Lee were paired up in an AccessLab a few years ago. Tessa was a town councillor, and Lee was a marine ecosystem modeller. And Tessa wanted to know, in her town, there are roughly 8 to 15 coaches full of tourists stopping off by the river in the summer nearly every day. And these coaches often leave their engines running for up to like 20, 30 minutes at a time. And she wanted to know, is this damaging the environment? Is it damaging people's health? Should we be stopping them? And if so, how? So Tessa and Lee in their afternoon session managed to calculate the amount of carbon that would roughly have been emitted by these coaches on a given day or week. They also found papers on the link between air pollution and death in the UK. They also found other news articles about other town councils that had gone about banning idling. And so Tessa used all this information, took it with her back to the council, and used it to gain funding for signs all along the river like this one, and for the local police to actually enforce it. I think this is just a really nice, tangible result of pairing up scientists with people in the community and providing them with the evidence they need to just do their job sometimes. Aside from, I think of AccessLab as something that has quite abstract and philosophical benefits in creating trust in science and all these things, but here's just a very tangible benefit, and a decision was made as a result of Tessa having the information she needed. Okay, so here's just some feedback on our workshops so far. I would have thought this post-it on the left was me if I didn't know that it's not my handwriting. But yeah, someone wrote this has been quite a utopian model of a day, which I would have to agree with. Someone else wrote that it was helpful to work with the research partner. It was most helpful seeing how they looked for research and what they looked for. And someone from the policy sector said, it's a long time since I was part of a workshop that gave me so much in one day. So yeah, this is the kinds of feedback that we've had. Hopefully in the future, because we now know that we can do online versions of this that work pretty well and get similar feedback, it should be much more easy to roll this out nationally, hopefully. Personally, I would love to see every university in the country doing an AccessLab every term, but obviously they need funding. But we do have a how to run an AccessLab document freely available online. There's also a paper published in PLOS all about this AccessLab model, some of the results. And we ideally, if we get the time and maybe some more funding, we want to really make proper professional videos online of all of the talks that we do and all of the discussion sessions that we do at an AccessLab to be available for everyone. Of course, I absolutely love this workshop. I think it's brilliant, but I should probably also say that, it's not perfect. It's one approach. One way in which probably it does need improving is that, of course, recruiting researchers is very easy because researchers often want to do science communication. They're used to doing things for free in their spare time because it can go on their CV. But asking a participant to come along, taking up their free time, they get a free lunch, but what's in it for them? It's kind of hard to communicate that before they've been. And the way we've recruited people is, focusing on certain groups. So we had a voluntary one with Extinction Rebellion members, so activists coming to find more scientific information. And so this is something that needs to be looked at, because I think so far the people who have come probably are people who are not afraid of science, or not probably people who are already kind of interested, or at least have a little bit of an idea as to what science could bring for them. But it is important to note that we do always offer to pay for anyone's travel if they could come but they can't afford the travel. If they could come but they need childcare, we cost that in and offer to pay for participants' childcare. Similarly with the online ones, not everyone has great internet or laptops, so we offered to loan out laptops for anyone. All these things need to be worked on to make sure it's as accessible and inclusive as possible in future rollouts. Okay, so I'll just leave that there. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, about everyone having the right to freely share in scientific advancement and its benefits. There's also a slide at the end here with a few more resources linking back to the history of publishing that I talked about, the paper, more blogs. So if anyone wants to look into that further. And thanks, yeah, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Dr. Lotty Brown. That's that was really interesting. I'm just a really fresh take on open research. We've got a few questions. I'm hoping people might still throw a few questions in here as well, but I would like to start. You kind of touched briefly on the topic. So Tom Stafford is asking, so presumably people who come along to the AccessLab are very open to learning about research. Do you think this approach would work with participants who are very skeptical or hostile to science or orthodoxy?
Yeah, this is, I guess, one of the main problems we've thought about is how to recruit people who already have like quite a strong distrust of science. One interesting thing that happened early on was that because there was no real affiliation with the university, a lot of participants came and said the fact that it wasn't affiliated with the university made them trust it more and come along more, as it seemed more independent. So that's something to think about. The earlier pilots were funded by an Arts Council funded organisation called Feast. And so that first one was aimed at artists. So it was, artists, are you researching anything at the moment for your creative outputs where you think access to scientific information might help? And I think that was quite successful because it seemed, there was something in it for them. They've been thinking about a certain topic and they'd maybe like a more scientific perspective on it for their arts output, and it was funded by an arts council. So there are definitely ways to get around this. Things like we've talked about trying to target areas where there's low vaccination uptake and communities that are quite high in anti-vaccination. And if you phrase it more as, do you have questions about vaccination? Are you confused about vaccination? Are you a parent who's worried about vaccination? Come and talk to independent researchers confidentially about your questions. I think people who are highly skeptical about science and have a mistrust in science usually would like the opportunity to talk about it more. I think a lot of the time these people have these fears and doubts, and they do a lot of retweeting and blogging and reading online. And if you say, actually come and talk to a person about this face to face and come and be with like-minded people, also about getting like-minded people together and say, we'll get a group of people who all feel worried about vaccination, and let's let you discuss it confidentially with someone who has access to the primary information. So I think there are ways around it, but it's definitely one of the trickiest parts that we should think about. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you, Joel.
How can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry.
Also, I can't see any of these questions. To me, it looks like it's just me and you, but I assume there are other people.
Yeah, the questions come up on the Q&A. I'm kind of reading. Yeah. So in terms of local council, so do you get just individuals from the council contacting you guys because they've got questions that they need to make a decision on, or do you actually get contacted by local councils themselves, as in to get more information so that they can make decisions about policies?
So far it was just us trying to recruit people and saying, if you have questions, come along. And we had, discrete workshops that were running at certain times. So it's not like an open thing that anyone can approach at any time. There is, I think, a model, I think there's something called science shops somewhere in Europe where you can, a bit like a citizen's advice, office, you can just show up and say, I've got a question, I need a scientist, and they'll like find you a scientist, which is really cool. And I think that's partly what informed this model. And Amber Griffiths, who is the person at Foam Kerno, who's behind most of this, is I think working on something at the moment to look at pairing local councillors with scientists to specifically help them answer their questions and their policy decisions.
Okay. I think Amber, at least Taz Amber at Foam, just kind of chipped in and kind of mentioned that you've had quite a few conspiracy theorists coming to your sessions who wanted to look into their ideas more in detail, and it seemed to work quite well. So that's good to know. And just going to ask another question was more from the the researchers that you've paired with other people from a non-academic background. So is there like a level of their career that you kind of expect them to have? So are you expecting to be sort of more senior, or do you have sort of PhD students or early career researchers? And yeah, I was curious to know if actually have you got like quite a prevalence of one area of their academic career?
Yeah, that's a really good point, which I probably should have included, is that we normally we open it up to all researchers who are above the second year of their PhD, and that cutoff is kind of just to make sure that the researchers have at least had like a year of researching as a PhD student, potentially doing a literature review in their first year, just to make sure they are fully comfortable and to grips with using, primary scientific information in their research and investigating a question of their own. So that's cut off, and we do usually get mainly PhDs and postdocs. I think we've had a couple of lecturers, but it is heavily PhD and postdocs, which again might be a bit, well, it's a blessing and a curse. They're often more open to becoming very open science aware, but also it means it's probably people who are already kind of into this, have this frame of mind about opening up science to people outside. So yeah, that's something maybe we should think about. Maybe we should force some old lecturers and professors to take part one day.
And more of a kind of a final question, because you mentioned one of your slides was kind of the future, and you mentioned that you would like to see universities doing some of these workshops. So kind of sort of a long-term view, how do you see the future of other initiatives like the AccessLab? As in, do you see them do you see universities copying that model or contacting more projects like AccessLab?
Yeah, I hope so. So ideally, we kind of talked about this a while ago as to whether, I don't think it was never a main aim of the original workshops to kind of eventually roll these out nationally, but then we realized that a lot of researchers who were taking part got involved again and again and really enjoyed it, and a few have thought about running their own elsewhere. And I think we have, in our How to Run an AccessLab document, we've kind of said, ideally, you should have taken part in an AccessLab first yourself as a researcher before kind of rolling it out to other people and doing the recruiting and all the background organising. But I think that would be a a great way for it to kind of spread, but obviously it does need funding. I think there's around, I think it's, Amber mentioned £500 budgeted for each workshop, and that's to make sure we can cover the lunches for everyone, cover people's travel if they need it, cover people's childcare if they need it, hire a decent location, and all these things. So you know, it does need funding ideally, but it's not a huge amount if your researchers are willing to be volunteers. And so, yeah, I guess I would love to see more of it, because I think it's one of the main models I've seen outside of, or in the scientific communication world, I guess, that really does kind of throw away the kind of deficit model of science communication, where it's all about, we just need to give people knowledge, and then once we tell them the information, everything will be fine. I think it's more about teach them about the infrastructure behind science and what its strengths and its weaknesses are, and how scientists work and get their money, and how they publish their work, and how you can verify all this yourself by looking at the published work. I think all that can go a lot further in just creating trust, and then people can do their own investigating and their own reading, instead of us having to teach everyone everything.
That's brilliant. There's actually one more question, and which Nicholas asked, which kind of fits a bit into what you've just mentioned. But they're asking, do you think that politicizing scientific topics is an impediment to the acceptance of scientific facts, and whether this kind of in-group, out-group identity can play a role in denying scientific facts?
Yeah, that's a big couple of questions that probably need like 3 lectures each. But I would say, yeah, obviously, I mean, I think that is one of the things about this, is that the out-group, in-group thing applies, I think, with scientists. So there's a study showing that people often don't trust scientists because they don't think they're working in their favor. They don't think that scientists are part of their in-group, that they're just like them, but they're part of the kind of, you know, elite, or they're working for, you know, big companies or profit or whatever. And I think this does a really good job of showing who scientists are. They're just everyday people who are, you know, trying to get funding for their ideas. They're mainly doing their work because they find it interesting, and there's often not much more kind of like agenda other than that. So I think that's a big help in this kind of science denial thing that seems to be going on. Politicizing scientific topics. I mean, I think science is political. I think we can't really try and tear those things apart, but I don't really know if this is the time to get into that debate. Yeah, maybe we could chat about that on Twitter. The ideal.
And yet, I'm kind of aware of the time, and kind of I'm just going to the last question from the Q&A. So Wolfgang Lucas is saying, thank you for the wonderful presentation. And do you find that non-research participants are also becoming sensitized to problems or to these problems due to knowledge being hidden behind paywalls? Do they tend to become allies in advocating for open science, open publishing after they attended the sessions?
Yeah, and this is a really nice thing that happens, is that when we have those discussions about how it works, and there's that jaw-dropping moment where they're like, what? You have this nice conversation where they really do realize, especially for early career researchers, like what it's like and what the pressures are for people doing research, and the people who are doing the main research, like PhDs and postdocs, what the pressures actually are and what their aims actually are, and the barriers that preventing that, and it is a nice way to gain allies as well outside of science. And it also helps to eliminate some of these myths, that a lot of people just assume that when you publish a paper, you get paid for publishing the paper, and when someone pays to read the paper, it goes to the scientist, and that's often a very gobsmacking moment for people, where they were like, why would you not be, if you buy a book, the money goes to the author. And also helping to, again, spread the word that scientists want to share their information. They want their work to be out there for everyone. They really want people to read their work. And if you want to read their work, contacting them and asking to read it is amazing. And they definitely don't want their work hidden away from people. So yeah, that's another nice aspect of it.
Thank you. That's brilliant. So I think we'll